Welcome to History 111, Lecture 29, Antebellum Society. White Southern society in 1860 was about 8 million people. Now, there are almost 400,000 slaveholding families with an average family size of 5, so about 25% of the population belonged to one of these slaveholding families, and the other three-quarters of Southern society owned no slaves. Now, within this group of white Southern society, we can generally subdivide it into different classes. First, there's the planter aristocracy. These are people who own over 800 acres. These are people who own 40 or more slaves, and they have disproportionate power and influence. These are the people who have the wealth to survive economic downturns. And over time, they build up the myth of the aristocracy. And they imagine themselves as the guardians of the old, true South. This is a new phenomenon, though, starting about the 1830s, and it's these people who are really driven by cotton profits, and they really try to reinvent themselves as these chivalrous knights in white suits and so on, and they come up with this culture. And a part of the culture, they believed they were too good for commerce, but military life is where they belonged in their worldview. The planter class also prided themselves on codes of behavior, and they were heavily concerned with things like saving face, so insults could provoke very violent responses. Now, with regards to women in the South, the population had fairly well evened out, so women tended to live on farms and be very isolated from the outside world. Women are now more subordinate to men than they are in the North, and there's a very low level of female education by this point in time. Some additional groups we should know about are plain folk and hill people. Now, plain folk account for about 75% of the population, and they own few, if any, slaves. The majority of these people are subsistence farmers, and what subsistence farming means is that you basically are growing food to eat. Now, these people are very rarely able to make any profit because the majority of their crops goes towards sustaining their families, so they very rarely are able to stay out of debt or make any kind of money in the long term. For plain folk, there's also little, if any, access to education. Now, hill people, on the other hand, sometimes also called hillbillies, are fiercely independent. These are people who live very detached from society and have very little connection to it aside from their own extended kinship networks. They are very vehemently opposed to slavery and hate the planter class and feel the planter class is bad for the South. Now, most non-slaveholding whites depend on the plantation system because that's the market for their excess grain crops. Cotton gins are beyond the means of most small farmers and really are something only plantations have. So if you're a small farmer, you have to basically rent time on that cotton gin to process your cotton. Now, large planters tend to be engaged in extending some form of credit to their poor neighbors, and planters are often related to many of their poor neighbors in some fashion because Southerners tend to have very extended kinship networks at this stage. One of the things that dominates Southern culture at this point is this idea of paternalism. This operates around the head of the family. And on a plantation and a farm, the father was the head of the family, and the boss was workers and slaves and so on. And he had not only a responsibility to make sure everyone was looked after, he had a responsibility to make sure everyone was doing what they needed to do and that everyone was obeying him. Now, extensive kinship networks are going to mean also extending help to poor relatives. And that's going to mean that there's relationships between the different families in different places. Now, the planters are going to look at themselves as being the best of society with a duty to look after everyone else as if they are children. So, the planters are the fathers at the top, and they use this idea of a family structure with the father who has to look after everybody and use strict discipline to keep everybody in line as a model for society. So the planters really expected their authority would go unquestioned, and disobedience was often punished with harsh violence. Now, the Southerners at this time start to refer to what they call the peculiar institution. Now, the word peculiar tends to carry negative connotations when we use it today, but back then they really meant it to emphasize its uniqueness, and the white Southerners considered this a unique characteristic of the South. Now, slavery at this point realized is gone in more or less the Western world. Latin American revolutions had labeled slavery as a tool of colonial oppression and banned the institution start to move towards getting rid of all slavery within those territories. The British Empire had banned it in 1833. So within the West, it only remains in the South and Brazil and a few tiny territories that are in the possession of Spain. Now, it's also a non-Western world, but they're not thinking about that. So in other words, the white Southerners are looking around at their slaveholding plantations and saying that this is something that's really unique to this geographic region. And they believe it's a positive, good thing. Whereas today, we're going to look at that institution very differently. One of the things this institution of slavery produced were the slave codes, and these are strict laws to regulate slave behavior. And they include things like not being out after dark, no congregating in large groups, not having a gun, no hitting a white person, no testifying against white people, not being able to learn to read and write. And generally speaking, killing a slave was not considered a crime. In addition, there's what's called the single drop rule, which says that slavery is hereditary, and it doesn't matter how many free parents you might have, as long as one of your ancestors is a slave, it can be passed down to you. Despite all these laws, the reality of slavery varied widely. Slave codes were the realm of the courts, and the basic rule was this: a master was expected to punish his slaves, and the laws were there to ensure that slaves could be punished by the state if the master did not do so. And that really speaks to the utter paranoia about losing control of the slave system that exists in the South. Now, one of the key things to realize is that inciting a slave revolt is punishable by death, regardless of who you were. So, really, what it comes down to for the institution of slavery, these slave codes are something that exists as a safety measure as they see it, but it's really down to how each master treated the people and the nature of the work that was being done. And there are two key systems that are being used: the task system and the gang system. A task system, slaves are given a task to perform and then they're done for the day when it's done. So if it takes 2 hours, you're done in 2 hours. If it takes 12 hours, it takes 12 hours. Whatever length of time it takes a person to perform it. Now, under a task system, somebody would have an incentive to work hard so they can get home and basically have the rest of the day off. But the gang system, on the other hand, was a driver who worked slaves until he decided they were done. So he would keep them out in the field, working constantly until he felt that they had done enough work that day. Now, some other key realities we should know about slavery are that masters provide food, clothing, and housing, and slaves also had their own gardens and vegetables, but do realize that was really crude housing, that was very cheap clothing, and so on, and they really weren't given a lot. Medical care was provided by the masters, but often each plantation had one or more women who acted as midwives or healers, and that's where primary medical care came from. Now, slave women were also expected to work in the fields of the men and then do all the chores at home. Slave families were often divided with fathers living on different plantations, and slave marriages were not recognized by law in most places. The slave population is also going to decline relative to the white population this time due to poverty and high infant mortality. One thing to realize, though, is that while the conditions were harsh, brutal, and dehumanizing, the slaveholders did have an economic incentive to ensure the physical health of the slaves after importations banned. So dangerous work, for example, would be done by immigrants, particularly the Irish, since the master could always find others to take the job for low pay, whereas slaves were limited in number and expensive. And one of the results of this economic incentive to ensure the physical health of these people was the conditions of slaves were better than those experienced by some northern factory workers, and definitely better than those experienced in Europe. And there's also better conditions for American slaves than there are in the Caribbean, and they don't see the high death rates due to tropical diseases and so on. And that's all because slaves are extremely expensive and difficult to replace. So it's not something they're doing out of the goodness of their hearts by any stretch of the imagination, but it is something that limits how harshly these people are being treated. Now, one of the important groups of individuals we ought to know about are house slaves. Now, these individuals often engage in less demanding physical work, but they tend to be isolated from others and tend to be punished more frequently. And that's because these are individuals who are in direct contact with the masters and can be punished for even the least little thing. House slaves, especially the female slaves, are often subject to various forms of abuse, and they're typically the first people to leave the plantations after the war, and that has a lot to do with how horrible their experience was of it. Now, urban slaves, on the other hand, are a group that does exist, although not large in number, and they're going to engage in all forms of work where labor is short. So you're going to see things like dock workers, drivers, so on, although some of these individuals are skilled working as blacksmiths or carpenters, and those who are skilled could often earn enough money on the side, and some of them even bought their own freedom of that of their relatives. Now, urban slaves live in relative autonomy, and that's over time something that's going to increasingly make the white population nervous. There is also another population of free blacks, but they are mostly in Virginia and Maryland, and these are people who had earned money on the side and bought their freedom and that of their relatives. And their presence also makes the white population very nervous, and many people start to talk about how these individuals might be a source of inspiration for slave revolts. Now, large markets did grow up in those cities as well, and the slaves tend to be transported over large distances to be sold at auction. Now, a field hand might earn between $500 and $1,500 in the 1850s, but women are often sold at much higher prices in some very dehumanizing ways, and that tends to break up families. Do you remember that importation officially ends in 1808, but smuggling still occurs? And where there is smuggling, it tends to be from Cuba, and remember, Cuba is only 90 miles away from the United States. Now, in addition to the forms of passive resistance that were occurring in the South, like things like working slowly or breaking tools and stuff like that that people would do to resist the institution of slavery, there were some actual slave revolts. Prosper's revolt involves where 1,000 slaves gathered in Virginia, but were suppressed before it could begin. But that threat of a rebellion is going to lead to serious restrictions on free blacks who people believe were inspiring these things and on education for slaves. Now, Nat Turner's revolt involves a man who was a preacher who was also a slave, and this guy Nat Turner is going to gather about 70 other slaves armed with axes, and they're going to go around from house to house killing white people as they find them and acquiring more weapons and expanding their rebellion. Ultimately, it's put down by the military, but what happens is Nat Turner's revolt is going to put an end to the anti-slavery movement within the state of Virginia. Now, a lot of people in Virginia had felt that it was time to start scaling back slavery. It was unprofitable due to tobacco, and holding large numbers of slaves wasn't working, so a lot of people were freeing them. Now, this comes to a screeching halt because a lot of people believe that in the wake of Nat Turner's revolt, that the more free blacks there were, the more this would inspire slaves to take up arms and set off more violence. Nat Turner's rebellion is going to take that white Southern fear and is going to translate into serious restrictions on these individuals. For example, free blacks movement is very strictly limited as a result of this incident. So, for example, a lot of southern states would not allow them to enter. The state of Arkansas went so far as to order all free blacks within its borders to leave. And there was also serious restrictions placed on the ability of masters to free slaves. So they really want to curtail the free black population at this stage. Now, free black communities are going to thrive in some places like New Orleans and so on. Now, one final group we should talk about are the non-white slave owners. Now, while rare, some free blacks were wealthy and owned slaves, but a lot of slaves were in particular held by the five civilized tribes. Now, about 25% of the Cherokee population in Indian Territory were slaves of African descent, and that's pretty well on par with the white South. Should also mention that some of the factions of the five tribes are going to join the Confederacy, and a lot of them are going to remain neutral, though, and a small number joining the Union. Now, one of the reasons why they're going to join the Confederacy is the Confederacy is going to promise them some things like statehood. And they're looking at it in terms of the Confederacy is going to offer them a better deal than the Union is going to. And so those factions that are going to break the neutrality are going to side with the people with making the best offer. So what's the big idea here? Well, first and foremost, the antebellum South is full of class divisions, and importantly, there's the planter class. That's about 25% of the population. But we have to understand, the rest of the South is dependent on them in some way, and that creates a very deep and strong relationship there. And don't forget about things like paternalism and how there's this idea these planters have a duty to look after everyone else. And again, the key feature of the South at this point is slavery. It's a harsh and dehumanizing institution, and it's one that allows these planters and others to exploit the labor of these people for economic gain, and it's going to really drive that cotton economy we talked about in the previous lecture. See you in the next lecture.